and I am the program manager for the Gun-Involved Violence Elimination Initiative here at DCJS. And I just wanted to welcome you all today and welcome you to the symposium. So our presentation today is going to be entitled Implementing Evidence-Based Policing. And I'll give you a quick overview. The session addresses key issues and presents a case study of evidence-based policing in action, a 4-month multi-agency study of vehicle cruiser lights to enhance police visibility. The study findings will be discussed with an emphasis on lessons learned, informing future efforts by practitioners to innovate and evaluate policing practices. So our two presenters come from two various departments. Lieutenant Jason Potts comes from the Vallejo, California Police Department. He's a lieutenant there, and he served 19 years, currently assigned to the Patrol Division as a watch commander, an administrative lieutenant where he leads the department's field training program, special projects, and youth services section. Jason's also a military reserve special agent with the Coast Guard Investigative Services and routinely travels to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri to assist with the instruction of trauma-informed interviewing techniques to military agents. Our second presenter is Sergeant Jeremiah Johnson from the Darien, Connecticut Police Department. He is a policing researcher and practitioner. He served since 2002. He's currently employed by the University of New Haven, where he's appointed as a practitioner in residency at the Henry C. Lee College of Criminal Justice. He's affiliated with the Police Foundation of Washington, D.C., where he proudly serves as a policing fellow and is a recent alumnus of the National Institute of Justice's Lead Scholar Program. I will turn it over to our presenters. Thank you. You want this on or you want to use?
I think got it. Okay. All right, good morning, guys. Again, my name is Jason Potts. I'm honored to be here. A little bit about me. Again, I'm a lieutenant in Vallejo, California. It's between Oakland and Sacramento. It's a city of about 120,000. We're pretty diverse. High crime area. The point I'm trying to make, we filed bankruptcy in 2008. We've had a lot of budgetary and resource challenges. Some of my experience, I'm an operational guy, not really involved in this at all as far as how I saw my career at the beginning. I was fortunate enough to be selected as an NIJ lead scholar. And so I kind of bought into this, and we're going to show some examples on practitioner-led in the kind of the vein of rapid research with a group called Betagov. They're out of New York University, and they're great. So we'll talk more about that. But again, the point I'm trying to make when you guys are listening to me is that if I can do it in my jurisdiction with my resource challenges and the things that we have to deal with, then anyone can. So with that, I'll give it to Jeremiah.
So my name is Jeremiah Johnson, and I think when I started in policing, I kind of wanted to be the guy that Jason is, kind of doing the running and gunning. But I was hired by a police department that actually had a very nice contractual provision that paid for 100% of books and tuition. So I took full advantage of that, got a couple of graduate degrees, and ended up, I went to John Jay. So that whole process kind of shifted my way of thinking and got me exposed to this idea of evidence-based policing, and today is going to be a bit of a primer on that. So if you don't know anything about evidence-based policing, we'll give you a bit of a baseline knowledge on that, but we're also going to illustrate how evidence-based policing can be implemented at the local level in two very different jurisdictions.
And so I just want to say something. When we're saying something, please raise your hands. If you guys have any questions, just kind of raise your hands and just let us know if you have any concerns or anything like that, or you don't understand what we're saying. So when we talk about implementing evidence-based policing, I was just going to say this. Evidence-based policing is using the best available research, science, and data to inform our policies, procedures, and strategies, right? So when we say that, I would also say this: the craft of policing is very, very important. And no one's suggesting that we eliminate the craft of policing, but suggesting that we enhance it with the best available science, data, and research. And that's really what my definition of evidence-based policing is. But right here, this is a tale of two cities, Vallejo, California, and Darien, Connecticut. Again, I kind of talked about Vallejo. It's a bedroom community in San Francisco, 120,000. It's 22% white. Median household income is $65,000. Our violent crime rate is 8.6 per 1,000. As you can see, the comparison to Darien Connecticut.
Yeah, just to illustrate, Darien, a couple hours from here, our violent crime rate is very low. You may or may not be able to see the decimal point there. It's 0.14, not 14 per 1,000 residents. Our last, to give you a little bit of context, our last felony traffic stop was this summer, and the operator was actually the general manager of the New York Yankees, Brian Cashman. You might have seen that on ESPN. That was us. So that's the level of violence that for some reason that seemed to give Red Sox fans a lot of glee. But that's our context. And so I think by illustrating the difference between these two jurisdictions, you'll be able to see that evidence-based policing has a seat at the table in the whole spectrum of American policing.
And this is practitioner-led. So when I say practitioner-led, it's practitioner-centered. And so we're doing things, we're proud of the simplicity of the design, the ease of replication. We did some of our studies in 34 days, 55 days, 75 days. So this doesn't need to be lengthy. This doesn't need to be 3 years. I mean, there's a place for that, obviously, but this can be done in kind of a rapid research kind of type of vein. So this is have some fun with this. Give you guys a moment to kind of look at those assertions, those statements there, and then we'll go down the line there. And this is kind of a thing on how do you know that? Renee Mitchell, who's the president of the American Society of Evidence-Based Policing, she always talks about, hey, how do we know that? So let's talk about when somebody's asking you something, well, they're just going to throw out a statement. How do you know that? And push back on them. So we'll go through the first one. Sugar makes kids hyperactive. True or false? I didn't hear any trues. It's false. Milk increases mucus. That's false. We only use 10% of our brains. Some of us. It's false. We lose most body heat through our heads. That's false. This one got me. We have different learning styles, auditory, visual, and tactile or kinesthetic. I'm an FTO coordinator, and I always think some of our trainees learn in these different ways, but no, they don't. They learn depending on the situation. So if you're trying to teach a foreign language, you're not going to be a kinesthetic or a tactile learner, are you? You're going to probably be more auditory, visual. Rust causes tetanus. False. You guys see where we're going with this. Hair and nail continues to grow after death. That's false. Somebody in another presentation in Tennessee said, yeah, that's true. I saw it on a Poltergeist movie. So, spicy food causes ulcers. False. Dog's mouths are cleaner than human mouths. False. And then during a full moon, crime increases. So this is some anecdotal stuff, right? So the whole point of this is, how do you know that? And if you guys don't believe me, Google that shit, as they say, right? But during a full moon, crime increases. So we actually did a data evaluation project with Betagov. We did 100 months, and we looked at new moon data compared to full moon data, and there's absolutely no difference. And we did that over 4 months. And we're just looking at the comparison. So, and that's going to be a central theme here is comparison groups and how critical they are to evidence-based policing. And this is another fun one. If you guys can just get a piece of paper out, and I'll challenge you guys. If anyone gets this right, I'll send you guys a Jerry Ratcliffe's Reducing Crime book. Hopefully only one person gets it right. So just get out a piece of paper, and then I'll collect them when Jeremiah is talking here next. So what we're looking for, and this is based on the National Academy of Sciences. And so Jerry Ratcliffe actually provided this to me. But these are David Weisberg and some other folks, major criminologists that were part of this. And they found during a systematic review, there's only four of these programs or strategies in policing that are effective. So there's hotspot policing, predictive policing, third-party policing. That's your store owners, your apartment managers, folks that are, you're doing ordinances and that kind of thing. Jeremiah, you know more a little bit about that. You can explain that, the ordinances and that kind of thing with third-party policing.
Third-party policing is just sort of an intervention where the police department will get involved in trying to encourage property managers and property owners to do what they should be doing, and sometimes coerce that type of behavior to regain control over some of those spaces.
It's leveraging and that kind of thing with your neighborhood law programs. So then the active CCT monitoring, broken windows, and you guys see it. So there's four of those. If you guys can take a moment on a piece of paper, I'll collect if you can bring it up in the front, and then put your name on it, and then we'll see if you guys can get it right. And so real quickly, while you guys are doing that, how many researchers in the room? Just to raise your hands. And then for the most part, the rest of us are cops. Any chiefs in the room? You guys need some more time? There you go.
So this was mentioned, if you were in the room for the last presentation, there was a little bit of discussion about best practices and how they may or may not be evidence-based. So there are a couple different organizations that like to, at training, talk about best practices. And what is a best practice? This is one of the things that I looked at a little bit in my research at John Jay, was how innovations and ideas diffuse in policing. And what you find with best practices is a lot of times cops were smart. We see that there's not necessarily a need to reinvent the wheel, so we look to neighboring organizations, or we look to maybe those cosmopolitan organizations, the large agencies, because we think they must be doing it right. So we'll look to them, and the way you see these best practices emerge is it kind of becomes a bandwagon. And a couple people start doing it, other agencies jump on board, and you see more and more people getting on board without any real sense of whether or not this is effective or efficient. There's not a good evidence base to back up the efficiency or efficacy of best practices. So this is a key point, that best practices are not evidence-based. So what is evidence-based policing? Jason mentioned it briefly in the introduction. The key element is basically taking your practices on the best available evidence, right? Research and science is always advancing. There are new findings constantly coming forth. So we should be basing what we do on the best available evidence based on science, right? And that involves evaluation and experimentation and testing. And there's a actual body of knowledge in policing that tells us what works and what doesn't, but we don't always pay attention to it. This movement began a couple decades ago. Larry Sherman is sort of the father of evidence-based policing. And so we look to a lot of his writings and other researchers. And the idea is to make this now a practitioner-led movement, where it's not just the academics that are pushing this, but actual working cops that are picking up the mantle and moving it forward.
So the standard model of policing, so typically we do the 3 R's, right? Random, patrol, rapid response, reactive investigations, as opposed to maybe targeting, testing, and tracking the data. And that's from Lawrence Sherman's seminal paper sometime in the 2000s. But that's what we focus on, unfortunately. But what happens if we could focus on the data and target and test and track the data? And the real magic, or the real gold in policing, as Cynthia Lum likes to say, is between our calls for service. If we can be proactive and look at things in a data-driven way between these calls for service, that's where the magic is going to happen. And so case of place investigation, if we could investigate a place as an investigator investigates a person, imagine how much of an impact we'd have. So a lot of research out there, 3 to 5% of any city jurisdiction accounts for 50% of all crime. If you really want to look at it in simple terms, 50% of your city's jurisdiction accounts for 100% of the crime. So that's half of your city that doesn't have any crime at all. And that's from Weisberg in 2004. And it's not evenly distributed across locations. It's very isolated and it's stubborn. And so this is just an example from Austin, Texas, 2014 to 2016. As you can see, very little red there. If we zoomed in, you just see a few stubborn city blocks where it accounts for most of the crime. And so evidence-based policing kind of gets its roots in evidence-based medicine. And so a lot of things that we do in policing that we talked about in the prior classes, you want to do less harm. And so things like DARE were debunked and Scared Straight were debunked with randomized control trials. And we're going to talk about that. Essentially what they are is you have an intervention, you have a treatment group, and you compare it to a control or business as usual. And what they found is that when they do that, it's rigorous. It turns those shades of gray into more black and white. And so critical incident stress debriefing has even been shown to be more harmful. So in medicine, turning up oxygen on preemies in the incubator, intuitively you would think, oh, that would work. But they found actually that it was causing these babies to go blind. Alice Stewart discovered that x-rays cause cancer in children, unborn children. So wouldn't have known that unless you test it, right? Unless you look at the data and the research. And so I like this example. If you could click again. Semmelweis, this is just kind of the resistance. This is in 1861. Ignaz Semmelweis is an obstetrician, and he wants to know why women are dying of child bed fever at this one clinic or this doctor's area. And so what's happening is the doctors are having an autopsy, and they're coming with cadaverous particles, and they're giving birth to these babies, and these women are dying at 5 times the rate of the clinic where the midwives are at. And so, click it again, he wanted to know what was happening, so he did some research and did kind of a study and a trial, and he found that if the doctors just washed their hands with chlorinated lime, they would reduce these deaths. And so the lesson here is even back then, these women are being saved, and they were still resistant to it. This guy was ostracized and kind of pushed out of it and went to a insane asylum, I believe, because he was so ostracized in his cadre of obstetricians that that's what happened. So that's the lesson, is that it happens. There's going to be resistance in evidence-based policing when you're trying to do these things. There's just going to be that, and especially when union pushback and that kind of thing. We'll talk about how we overcame some of that.
So most of the attendees, I imagine, are from New York, and we're not that far from the epicenter of CompStat, where 25 years or so ago, you've got William Bratton, Jack Maple, they come up with this revolutionary system in New York City to address crime, system of managerial accountability, and that CompStat model has really diffused within the last few years, and it's a good system, and what it helps us do is track crime trends, right, in different jurisdictions, and we're often looking at, depending on how frequently the meetings are, we're looking at changes in time over the last week or month, and if we really want to get sophisticated, maybe we're benchmarking off of, say, the same time period last year, or we're looking at fiscal year, so thus far compared to last year. And this is useful, it is good for policing, but it misses a lot of things because you can't really tell a lot of the time what is responsible for the changes in the crime data. There are lots of variables that come into play when it comes to crime, and not all of those are things that the police control. But a lot of times we attribute our particular intervention as being responsible for the crime increase or decrease, right? So a lot of policing interventions, you may have heard of problem-oriented policing. There's a session on that later this afternoon, I believe, if you're not familiar with it. These are simple, what we call pre- and post designs, where we sort of have a baseline measure of a particular crime phenomenon, and then we have an intervention, something that the police do to address that problem. And then we do some analysis after the fact to try and tell whether or not our intervention was effective. There's nothing wrong with this design. It's good, and it's something that policing agencies should be undertaking, particularly that problem-oriented policing model. But there are some limitations when it comes to our ability to actually infer whether or not there is a causal effect. Is what we're doing actually responsible for the changes that we're seeing in the data?
So this is, again, Jeremiah talked about problem-oriented policing, the SARA, scan, analyze, respond, and assess. A lot of times we do the scan, analyze, and respond, but we don't assess. And so that's really what this is about, is really diving deep into your problems and figuring out what they are. So we're going to talk about theft issues that we had in our jurisdiction. But if you want to know, why are you having this copper theft? Well, what kind of theft? Copper theft. Well, why are they having these issues? Well, the recyclers are buying this stuff. And so we're having issues with folks focusing on, they're targeting iPhones and MacBooks. And we want to know why. Why are they targeting on this? They're probably selling it to these liquor stores and that kind of thing. So if you really can dive deep and kind of get into that root cause analysis, and that's this next slide here. So really look at the hot places, hot people, and hot times and be data-driven about it. And so this is just a real quick example from the Jefferson Memorial on really asking why. And I'll go ahead and just let you guys listen to it.
Years ago, the stone exterior was deteriorating at the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C., a popular monument in the United States. Repairing the stone or painting over the worn areas was too expensive, so park rangers turned to root cause analysis and started asking why.
Why was the stone deteriorating?
High-powered sprayers were being used to wash the memorial every 2 weeks.
Why were high-powered washings needed every 2 weeks?
Because of bird droppings.
Asking why stopped because it seemed the cause was found. Workers put nets around the building, but they were unsightly, and the birds found ways around them. So it was back to the drawing board, or the 5 whys.
Why are there so many birds?
They come to feed on spiders.
Why are there so many spiders?
They feed on insects at night.
Why are there so many insects?
They're attracted by lights that shine on the memorial at night.
With a new cause found, questions stopped, and a plan was created to reduce the amount of time the memorial spent in the spotlight at night, and it worked. The insects were reduced by 90%, and with the root cause removed, the excessive cleaning was no longer needed. An unexpected benefit was a cost savings realized by using less electricity. This highlights how root cause analysis can involve trial and error, and how the 5 whys isn't always limited to exactly 5 questions. Read more about root cause analysis and the Jefferson Memorial story at the link below.
So again, that's just asking the right questions. That's really what evidence-based policing is asking the right questions and really diving deep into your problems and figuring it out.
So that type of root cause analysis can lead you to develop an intervention and perhaps test on whether or not that intervention is making a difference. However, from a more sophisticated research perspective, there are certain what we call threats to validity that may interfere with our ability to make that causal connection between what we're doing and some of the outcomes that we're seeing. So this is not an exhaustive list, but I'm just going to talk about 4 of the threats to validity that are, I think, probably the most pernicious when it comes to policing research. First one is history. These can be sort of large-scale policy changes, even on the state level. So I think a couple months ago in New York, right, they decriminalized marijuana. So that may cause some changes in enforcement patterns, in offender patterns. Looking at other states, maybe not as much, but even local policy changes can influence police behavior. And I think when you're talking about practitioner-led research, this is actually where police departments have an advantage, because a lot of times we know what's happening inside our own agencies. But for external researchers, this is problematic, because even something simple like a change in a form that we might be using for stop and frisk type encounters, right, could have unintended consequences and change patterns of officer behavior, and consequently change the data and things that we're measuring in a simple pre and post design study. Another one is regression to the mean. So when I do some police training for chiefs in Connecticut, some of these deputy chiefs and chiefs are thinking about moving to another agency, and the advice that I give them is kind of counterintuitive. I say, look for an agency that's experienced the largest crime spike over the last year, because when you go into that place, even if you don't change anything, chances are that those crime trends are going to regress to the mean, that they're basically going to come down just by virtue of this particular phenomenon. which you can see it's not limited to crime. You can see it in lots of different contexts, even sports. So the most sensitive changes in regression to the mean is when you see large drops or large increases. You're going to probably return to that baseline. But if you're not familiar with it, this may cause you to misattribute your intervention for being responsible for the observed change. Another one is selection bias. So at least in this part of the country, it's heavily unionized. When police departments want to make changes or even roll out new technology, a lot of times this is something that has to be bargained with unions and things like that. So sort of an end around that a lot of police departments will do is they'll ask for volunteers, right? And sometimes if they have a pilot program that's being pursued with volunteers, they may look at how those volunteers behave. But this is, again, problematic because the volunteers may differ from those other individuals within the agency that did not volunteer. So we call this selection bias, and it often has to do with this idea of self-selecting. So this is problematic in policing research, even if, say, you were to look at accredited agencies, right? These agencies are self-selecting an accreditation program. So you can't necessarily say that there's a real difference between these organizations because they have self-selected or volunteered. Another issue is contamination bias. I don't know if we have any people in the room where they get weirded out if their food touches each other on the plate. But when it comes to research, you don't want contamination. You don't want spillover. And when you are doing a more sophisticated design, or even if you're just, say, training a certain portion of your department or equipping a particular portion of your department with a new piece of technology, you can have this sort of spillover effect. So there's been a lot of body camera research over the last couple of years. One that happened to get a lot of media attention was Washington, D.C., D.C. Metro Police. And you had this basically showed that there was no effect of body cameras. But when you read through the study, you see that they did actually have a spillover effect. This is not a surprise to many of us in the room. Cops back each other up. Right, so if you have officers that are not equipped with body cameras and those that are, when you have the responding officer coming as backup that has a body camera, it may change the encounter at the stop, right? So you can have the spillover effect that can change behavior. And this may limit your ability to infer causation. And that's really what we're trying to get at when we have these more sophisticated designs known as randomized controlled trials. Probably the most familiar context that you would have heard of this from is medical drug trials, right? And this is where you would have two different groups. One would receive the medication, the other would receive a placebo. This isn't always possible in policing, right? Where a lot of times both groups know who is in the treatment group and who is in the control group. But the key aspect of a randomized control trial is the R, is the randomization. And that's where you are randomly assigning. In the graphic, it's showing individuals that are being randomly assigned. But you can randomly assign anything in an intervention. You can randomize by shift. You can randomize by geographic area. So there are lots of different options. But the one key is you have a control group that does not receive the intervention. So we are going to be talking about some randomized control trials done at the local level. But essentially, you have your intervention, you compare the results, and the control group is the group that essentially preserves our ability to make that causal inference because they're subject to the same validity threats that the treatment group is when it comes to history and some of the other slides that I talked about.
So the bare minimum for evidence-based policing is a comparison group. That's just that's the essential part of it, is just comparison. And so back to the randomized control trial, one of the great examples I like is if you were a business owner and you had a new website, how would you know your website, you logged those efforts for that website, how would you know that your website was increasing your profits. You wouldn't unless you directed it to your old website and then you measured the data. And that's looking at the comparison groups. And that's what that means. It's turning those shades of gray into black and white. And that's really what a randomized control trial is. It's just, again, looking at those comparison groups. And we'll show you some examples here in a second. So really quickly, just a kind of a show of hands on a poll. What do you think prevents your agency from conducting research to improve processes? I'm just curious if you guys can share with me. So for me, I think it was between workload and it was between A and B. What do you guys think? Anyone think it's anything different? Resistance to change? What do they say about cops? They hate the way things are and they hate change. That's just human nature, though. So anyway, when I was in Tennessee just recently, it was the same. It was pretty much between A and B. So we mentioned this really quickly. Practitioner-led, those closest to problems empowered to come up with a solution. So Angela Hawken likes to say this: fail forward, fail fast, and look at the data in context. Angela Hawken is Betagov director, and we'll talk about that group here in a minute. But just how did we know that our interventions are working unless we're testing them, unless we're kind of failing forward, we're looking at things and embracing failure? Maybe someday we'll get to that point in policing that we do that. The airline industry does it with near misses. Why can't we do it in policing? So I would assert to you that we can, we just don't. And so that's Betagov, that's Angela Hawken, and if anyone at break wants to come up, I can introduce you to Angela. She's actually presenting at the same time now. They're great. So they're out of New York University, they're a nonprofit. They provide a PhD, case manager, and a statistician. It's all for free. And they'll design the methodology for you. And again, we did our study in 34 days. I'm going to talk about that here shortly. We also did a 55-day study and a 75-day study. And again, if we can do it and I can do it, anyone can. And this goofy-looking guy on the right, that's Jeff Bezos, Amazon CEO. And so he talks about double your number of experiments and you double your inventiveness and just your innovations. And so maybe we can get to that point where we're kind of beta testing, constantly beta testing in policing.
So at this point, I'm going to speak a little bit about the intervention that I did in concert with Betagov. And this was done along the Connecticut shoreline, sort of these smaller agencies, typically affluent residential communities. And the intervention that we tested was this idea of running what we call cruise lights. Essentially, they are static red and blue lights that are illuminated, and this particular intervention was done exclusively on the midnight shift in these different jurisdictions. So we know a lot about the effects of police presence. There's a good body of empirical literature that has informed hotspots policing, but when it comes to visibility, how visible either those officers on foot patrol are or those police units, there's very little. This particular study that we did, we were doing it in the fall of 2017. Shortly, I think while we were in the middle of it, some results came forward from the Philadelphia Predictive Policing Experiment led by Jerry Ratcliffe and his colleagues at Temple University. And he found that there was, when it came to property crime, there was actually an effect when they had marked units present in these predicted hotspots and no effect when they had unmarked cars. So this gave us some sort of sense that visibility has something to do with it and not just presence alone. So the research question that we asked was that does increased patrol lighting affect overnight motor vehicle crime? Although we don't have a lot of violent crime in my jurisdiction, we do have this persistent problem with vehicle theft and motor vehicle burglaries. And from maybe the cops' perspective, this was counterintuitive because cops always want to go out and catch the bad guys, and making themselves more visible was probably the last thing that they wanted to do. We did a randomized control trial. The thing that we randomized was actually the shift. So we had, I believe it was 4 months, 122 calendar days. We stratified by day of week, although we didn't have to, but we wanted the officers to see that we had an equal number of weekends and weekend nights and things like that in the process. But essentially, 61 shifts lights on, 61 shifts lights off. And basically when the officers came to roll call, they were informed what the lighting condition would be, and they were supposed to do that for the duration of the 8-hour shift. We also put calendars in the patrol cars so they could know. When you are implementing practices, when you are testing, you always have to consider officer safety. So we did want to build in a little bit of flexibility because responding to a particular call of service, like a domestic, the officer might not feel safe, obviously, having their vehicle illuminated. Just something a little bit on officer safety. If you do decide to try and implement this, Dayton, Ohio actually implemented this cruise light strategy about a year after we did. And as most of you know, Dayton had that shooting. So if you watch the viral video, you can actually see the cruise lights were on in one of those vehicles. Again, this was never meant to deter violent crime. It was meant for property crime. But interestingly enough, Dayton is still running with cruise lights in that Oregon district, and there's good feedback from the community that when it comes to safety. But this is something you want to build into some of your experiments to make sure that you have buy-in, because if cops don't feel safe, they're not going to adhere to the experimental conditions. So these were some of our outcomes across the 3 different agencies. Again, these are all very low crime jurisdictions, so while the percentages look large, you have to consider in context we're actually dealing with very small numbers. What is interesting is that all of our sort of outcomes, both primary and secondary, dropped, right, when it came to both crime, but then some other things like motor vehicle accidents and traffic stops. So we did some statistical analysis on this, and there was only one statistically significant variable. That was traffic stops. However, most of that was accounted for by one agency in particular, but not a lot of statistical significance, but I think it was important that all of the variables did move in the hypothesized direction. So there were some limitations, as there is with all experiments. We were doing this during a particularly slow season. Most of our overnight vehicle activity happens during the summer, but being that it was a multi-agency experiment, it took a lot to get everybody on board. So there was also, all of these agencies, we just engage in randomized patrol. You get your beat assignment, you drive around. Nobody's engaged in hotspots policing. So that's a limitation. We don't know if it works in hotspots. And we don't necessarily know whether it changed the patrol style, if the police officers were more likely to stay in one area rather than to drive around. The biggest limitation, I think, is this idea of fidelity, right? How faithful were the police officers in actually following the condition, right? Keeping their lights on or keeping their lights off. So I think there were some good takeaways here based on this research. Number one, it's a really low-cost intervention, especially if your vehicles are already equipped with these LED light bars. Very little cost. There is some evidence, at least from one jurisdiction, that it did decrease the number of traffic stops. So you may be able to reduce the aggregate number of individuals that you're dealing with. I would include a point of caution that it may also change the types of stops that they are making. You're probably going to have fewer moving violations and more equipment and status violations, which could shift things demographically if you are concerned about profiling, but it did drop the aggregate number of stops. This is the one-pager that was produced by Betagov, and if you want to email me, I can send it to you, but it's a very nice synopsis, and Betagov does this for all of their trials. And we're just going to talk about the importance of replication, because we're going to move into Jason's experiment where he, in part, replicated this particular intervention that we did in Darien. So we used scientific methods. It was a scientific study, but a single standalone study is not necessarily science, right? If we made all of our policy decisions based on a single study, we'd probably get ourselves into some trouble. replication is very important because that is what's going to build the body of scientific evidence. And in certain disciplines, there is a replication crisis, particularly in psychology. When they try replicating a lot of these studies, they don't replicate. So it's very important in policing that we engage in replication so we can find out what works. And some of this may depend a little bit on the individual jurisdiction, but when we do replicate, we can get a sense of whether or not a particular practice is effective.
So really quickly, this is our 34-day trial. It's basically a replicated Jeremiah. So a lot of times, again, Jeremiah touched on this, cops hate to deter, and they hate to just go out there and deter crime. They want to chase, they want to hunt, and they want to go after it. And so I had some pushback, obviously. And so you guys probably thinking, well, how did I overcome that pushback? And I think for us, it's just to kind of think at it inversely. It's not about demonstrating something works. It's also about showing that it may not work as well. And I think that resonates with cops as well, is that when you try to explain it to them that, hey, this might not work, and there's other things that we can test out there. And if you do it quietly, which I did with a crime analyst and a few other folks, and it helps to have a little bit of positional authority, but I was able to do it. So our code 2 lights, which is our red, blue, and yellow, and we just did it for 34 days, 17 days on, 17 days off, and we stratified it to days, weekends, and everything else, and it was just kind of randomly picked that way. And so we did it on an overtime detail from 12 to 10 in a high-density shopping center, and we're targeting auto theft and theft from vehicle. And so we had some interesting outcomes, but this is some of our hot spots. You see on the top corner there, that's the high-density shopping center. It's a huge shopping center, probably your normal mall size, maybe 2 or 3 times bigger than that. And then we had another area down on the bottom left that we compared, or to the left there, and I'll show you that. Again, the importance of comparison groups. And so just really quickly, this is just an illustration of the challenges that we have. You can see there's Oakland, and then there's Vallejo with violent crime per 1,000. And then on the far right, you see the least staffed police staff per capita. We're at the bottom. So we just have extreme challenges. And again, I want to emphasize this. Again, if we can do it in our jurisdiction, and I can do it with my background. I've been a drug gang SWAT cop most of my career, just been exposed to academia. If I can do it, you all can as well. And so the problem was, you can see there on the top, we had our motor vehicle theft. We actually started to drop. We had a peak there, and we dropped in 2018 to 240. But our crime, our overall motor vehicle theft for the entire city has gone up. So what does that tell you? That our interventions are working. There's some diffusion of benefits there as well. And so these were text messages to the officers. So I did this at the beginning of their shift. I said, hey, thanks for stepping up. Today's lights on day. Deterrence and prevention of auto burgs and auto thefts is the end game. This is the exact text message that I sent out. And I said, code 2 lights while traversing inside the lots and while stationary and visible. So what we wanted to tell them is when they're going on the main roads, they didn't need to keep their lights on. That was an option for some folks. But I really just told them, hey, this is about deterrence. And if you keep your lights on, you might not have to write a report and that kind of thing. So again, it's framing it and selling it to them. So these were some of our outcomes. So for total auto crimes or motor vehicle theft, we had 6 for lights on versus 12 for lights off. And then this number here, auto thefts, that was just straight auto theft. We had 0 as opposed to 4. Again, you guys are probably looking at this, well, what's the limitation? It's the sample size. We had 34 days, so 17 days lights on, 17 days lights off. But what I found was interesting was our daily vehicle average registration checks, which are our 1028s, what we call them. And so that's objective data. And what we found when the lights were on, that's objective data that can't be skewed. It was a lot more checks. And so what that tells me is kind of a Hawthorne effect. Hey, the lieutenant knows this is an experiment. The lieutenant knows, hey, it's a lights on day. I got to be more active. And what we found when they were more active, driving around the lot, doing checks on vehicles, that this resulted in less vehicle theft. And that just makes sense to the cops in the room, that those folks that are more active, getting out of their cars and talking to folks, it's going to be better. So this is just kind of a graph. We had an outlier for that last day with our lights on, of 4, it was right at the last hour, so we would have had only 2 as opposed to 6. And then this is assessing the activity. As you can see there, the axis of 40 on the blue, that's us doing those registration checks, and that resulted in less auto theft. And so quickly, this is our theft deterrent strategy. The year before, we just tested a bunch of interventions. We did unoccupied police cars, we did GPS bait, we used crime prevention flyers, crime prevention awareness on an electronic bulletin board. We did undercover surveillance, we did undercover cameras, and we just tested it. We had a 40% drop from the previous year. We had some interesting things that we found out as well. So that's a hidden camera on the left. That was our GPS bait on the top right. We used a Milwaukee tool set. And again, we had some correlation there. And this was an interesting discovery, and you guys might see it in your jurisdiction, but we found just through surveillance and talking to informants that folks were actually targeting vehicles that were emitting a Bluetooth or a Wi-Fi signal. So, for example, if your phone, your MacBook is tethered to your iPhone and you leave your MacBook in your car, folks will go around looking for their personal hotspot with a phone. In this particular incident, the guy never even got out of the car. It was as if he knew the MacBook was in there. Pulled up right alongside it and was in and out in 30 seconds, broke the window and grabbed the bag containing the MacBook. Again, so we tell our folks through social media and everything else, don't leave electronic devices emitting signals in your car. That includes Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, any kind of signal, even your earpods and that kind of thing. So they're targeting that. And this is also another interesting thing we just discovered is that folks were using radio frequency jammers to jam their key fob. So that would do the entire parking lot. So folks would think that they were locking their car and they weren't. This is actually taken off of a suspect. And so they go into this car, and they're like ghosts. They grab stuff, they grab wallets, purses, and people just don't even report it half the time because hey, wait a minute, my car wasn't broken into, and sometimes they'll even lock the car. So that was interesting as well. And we were pushing all this stuff out to the public. And this is our Betagov analysis. It was a correlation plot, or correlation covariate, they call it. And so what we found was when folks were making contacts, were doing what we call FIs or field interrogations, making arrests, that led to less crime. It just makes sense. There's a study in 1975, I think it was Boydston, and then Gary Cordner did one in 1981 in Pontiac, Michigan, and they confirmed that as well. That makes sense to the cops in the room. When the cops are active, getting out of their car, being proactive, it's going to have an effect, and we showed that as well in our study. And so this is the point I'm making about comparisons. It's not really an apples for apples comparison. This is our intervention. Same exact time period, right? 8 November to 28 December. From 2016 to 2018, we had a 36% drop during that time period in our intervention area. And remember, we talked about the importance of comparison groups. This was the business as usual. We didn't do anything in this comparison group. Again, it's not apples for apples, but we had a 44% increase in motor vehicle thefts. Again, that's the importance of that comparison group. And you guys might be wondering, what are we doing now? Well, crime has gone back up, and it's actually an epidemic in our jurisdiction. And I can imagine it's probably in a lot of jurisdictions as well. It's going back up. So, but it's going up overall in the city, but in our plaza area, it's still pretty stable. So what kind of topics can evidence-based policing be used to research? So body-worn cameras, there's some studies out there, because I'm running out of time here, but theft deterrent strategies, virtual reality, ALPR, and that kind of thing. So we actually did an ALPR study and a virtual reality study with Betagov at the American Society of Evidence-Based Policing Conference. We did it just 2 days, and we had 80 participants. So that's the point. You can do these things in 2 days. You can do them in a week. And some folks will say this is like the Uber of research. We're taking away the Cadillac research, right? And it's not. It's just these are signals to inform larger studies. And so this is the automatic license plate reader. That's that snapshot that Jeremiah was talking about. And so what we did quickly, this is a 75-day study. We did alerts on versus alerts off, and we compared the data. And we blinded them to their control. And we were looking for stolen vehicles, arrests, and pursuits. And some might be thinking, well, randomized control trial isn't always appropriate. It's not always ethical, because what you're doing is you're withholding treatment from a certain group. And so in this situation, really quickly, you're probably thinking, wow, you turned off the activations to some of your cops. And I'll just go ahead and share it with you guys, is that they probably didn't realize what I was doing and maybe weren't paying attention. Some people did. And if you think about that, the implication of turning off activations when somebody's behind a stolen vehicle, it could be a problem. And so we had 24 recoveries versus 10 in the control. Just intuitively, it makes sense that it would work, right? We learned some things, that the fixed was a lot more effective for arrests because cops were able to sit downstream. Some investigative purposes or advantages, being able to be mobile and that kind of thing was a lot better for mobile, but fixed tons of investigative advantages. And then, so these are some of the practitioner resources that Jeremiah is going to go over.
So earlier I mentioned problem-oriented policing. There is an actual POP center that has a presence online. They also have an annual conference, and they do have awards for POP projects. But the most valuable resource is they sort of have a portfolio of topical interventions that have been tried and summarizing research. So if you are dealing with a specific crime problem in your jurisdiction, you can go to the POP Resource Center and look at what works and what has been found to be effective for strategies. We also have crimesolutions.gov. This is hosted by the National Institute of Justice, and what they do is they rate different programs. It's not specific to policing, but they will look at different interventions and they will rate them either as effective, promising, or not effective, sort of a red light, yellow light, green light type of system. And they're constantly putting out new evaluations as they are developed. And then we also have something called the Evidence-Based Policing Matrix, developed by the Center for Evidence-Based Policing out of George Mason University. And this particular graph is multidimensional, but they look at the level of intervention, whether that's individuals, groups, microplaces, or actual neighborhoods, jurisdictions. And then they'll look at the level of focus and whether or not it's proactive. And the key here is up in the upper left-hand corner, looking at the results key, and the black dots will show that it's effective. And also, you may notice some red triangles there. Those are actually studies and interventions that had, borrow a fancy word from the medical literature, iatrogenic effects. That means they actually had harmful effects. They backfired. So this is actually interactive when you're online, so you can click on it, you can get a brief synopsis, and you can get to the full study. But these are all very high-level, high-quality, randomized control designs in policing. I also just want to touch briefly on sources for research partnerships. All of you are likely spread out across the state. From a researcher's perspective, from a professor's perspective, they dream about being in their office and receiving an unsolicited call from a police department asking for help. Right? Researchers don't often, one of the big limitations for researchers is access to data. And while the open data movement is making this more viable for them, there's really no replacement for being able to have a researcher come into your organization, get the full context, and partner with you to either run an experiment or conduct a program evaluation. So I'd encourage you to look there. There are also some larger policing research centers around the country that will likely be happy to partner with you. There are also policing think tanks, as far as the National Police Foundation, that engages in research. And then you have nonprofit groups. We have already mentioned Betagov, and then also the American Society of Evidence-Based Policing, which is a practitioner-run group. They're all active law enforcement officers that are trying to move the ball forward and can be a good point of reference for you if you want to engage in some of this stuff. So I think at this point we're going to transition and move into questions.
Any questions? So I think the final points here is just the importance of comparison groups and really just those small incremental changes. So we did it in our organization, even with our strong union and that kind of thing, just making those small changes, being able to discuss what's in it for them. Because a lot of times the folks will go, well, why are you doing this? What's your agenda? What are you trying to do? When a toaster oven, are you trying to make captain? Are you trying to make chief? I mean, of course, you're going to get some of that pushback. But if you have a little bit of credibility, currency in your department, and you have some positional authority, you can sometimes make things happen. Be a critical consumer of evidence, and that's just for policing, is we also need to be the producers of this research, but also be the consumers of it as well. And then we're proud of the simplicity of design and the ease of replication. Again, we can do it. You guys can as well. 34-day trials, 55, 75-day. They don't need to be lengthy, and Betagov is free. And then just that decision-making, that kind of the way we think, just drilling down on things, the why, and that kind of thing. So with that, does anyone have any questions? Questions? And I'll leave you with this. The center line of science literacy, which not many people tell you, but I feel strongly, and I will go to my grave making this point, is how you think. Neil deGrasse Tyson. It's how you think. It's easy for us to sit here and say, oh, this was easy, because it wasn't. It was difficult as well, but it's worth it, especially when we're out here trying to do things for the right reasons and increase our legitimacy in the community. Just that's important. That's where the magic is, where we're actually partnering with our community and our researchers and getting this thing figured out in the right way. No questions, huh? Anyway, we're available if you guys want to come up and ask us anything. So anyway, we appreciate it. Thank you very much.